At the moment Scott realized something was wrong, the desert went quiet in a way that felt deliberate. Not peaceful. Watching. Wind froze. Birds vanished. Even the engine of his pickup ticked itself to silence as if it didn't want to be heard. Most people think desperation screams. They're wrong. Real desperation whispers, "This is your last shot." Scott Jones had spent 8 years learning how to survive on other men's land, fixing fences he'd never own, feeding cattle that weren't his, sleeping in bunkhouses that smelled like dust, sweat, and endings. Ranch life teaches you discipline, but it also teaches you exactly where you stand. And Scott stood at the bottom. By 26, his world had narrowed to two things: keep working or disappear quietly. The dreams he once had, college, travel, something bigger, had been buried under medical bills after his father died and left the family hollowed out. Scott didn't complain. Ranchers rarely do. But every night, staring at a cracked ceiling, he felt it. The pressure. The countdown. That's when he saw the listing. It wasn't flashy. No photos. No promises. Just a few lines buried deep in a county auction bulletin most people ignored. High desert land. Remote. No water rights. No structures. Back taxes owed. Minimum bid, $25. $25 doesn't buy lunch. It doesn't buy hope. It barely buys regret. Scott reread the listing 3 times, then folded the paper like it might vanish if he didn't trap it. His boss laughed when he mentioned it. Other ranch hands shook their heads. One of them said, "That's not land. That's a mistake someone forgot to clean up." But mistakes don't usually sit there waiting for you. The drive to Burns took 3 hours. His pickup rattled the whole way, coughing like an old animal that knew the trip might be its last. Scott rehearsed reasons to turn back. Gas money, time, embarrassment. But something heavier kept him moving. A feeling ranchers know well. The sense that land remembers who's willing to show up. The auction hall was small. Folding chairs. Coffee that tasted burned twice. Developers filled the front rows, confident and bored. They raised bids like it was a reflex, thousands at a time, not even looking at the paperwork. Scott stayed in the back, hat low, hands clenched. Property after property sold. Good land, water access, roads, fences, all gone in seconds. Then the room changed. "Lot 32, the auctioneer said, voice slowing. He cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses. High desert property, about 90 miles southeast. No road access, no utilities, no established water rights, sold as is. The air tightened. Someone laughed. Not kindly. The auctioneer hesitated. "We're starting at $25. Silence. That kind of silence isn't empty. It's judgment. It's everyone agreeing without speaking that this thing isn't worth touching. "Do I hear 25? The auctioneer repeated. Scott's hand rose before he gave himself permission. A few heads turned. A few eyebrows lifted. Someone muttered, "Poor kid." 25, the auctioneer said, surprised. "Do I hear 30? Nothing. Scott felt heat crawl up his neck. His pulse thumped in his ears. He waited for someone, anyone, to save him from this decision. Going once, going twice. Sold. The gavel cracked down, sharp and final. 15 minutes later, Scott walked out holding a deed to 240 acres of land no one else wanted and exactly $18 left in his wallet. The clerk processing the paperwork studied him for a long moment. "That land's been abandoned 30 years, the clerk said quietly. "Middle of nowhere, and I mean nowhere." Scott nodded. He didn't need convincing. He needed direction. 3 days later, he drove out to see what he'd actually bought. The road disappeared 20 miles before the property line. The rest, he walked. The desert stretched flat and brutal, scrub brush and rock under a sun that didn't forgive mistakes. No fences, no signs, just emptiness. And then he saw it, a shape near a dry ravine, too big to be a bush, too still to be a rock. Scott slowed. His ranch instincts screamed caution. Predators, injured animals. Trouble doesn't announce itself, it waits. As he got closer, the shape moved. It was a horse, skin pulled tight over ribs, head low, legs shaking. Its coat was dull, patchy, like it had been rubbed raw by survival. The animal lifted its head just enough to look at him, and in that look, Scott understood something terrifying. This land wasn't empty. It had been abandoned, and whatever had been left here was still fighting to live. Scott didn't move for several seconds. Neither did the horse. Out on the ranch, animals read hesitation better than people. One wrong step, one sudden motion, and fear turns into flight, or worse. Scott let his hands hang loose at his sides, palms open, the way old ranchers taught him when approaching something hurt and unpredictable. The horse blinked slowly. That was a good sign. But the tremor running through its legs wasn't. Scott scanned the ground as he took one careful step forward. No halter, no brand he could see from this distance, no fence anywhere near, just bone, dust, and an animal that looked like it had run out of reasons to keep going. "This land," Scott murmured to himself. "What did they do to you?" The horse snorted weakly, a dry sound that kicked up dust. Its ears twitched, but it didn't bolt. It couldn't. Ranchers know the difference between a horse choosing not to run and a horse that no longer has the strength. Scott's chest tightened. Someone had abandoned it here. That much was obvious. Ranchers don't leave horses behind unless something's gone badly wrong, or they're running from consequences. Either way, this animal had paid the price. Scott circled slowly, eyes scanning for water. A trough, a tank, anything. There was nothing. The ravine nearby was cracked and dry, a scar in the earth where water used to be. If rain ever came here, it didn't stay long enough to matter. He swallowed hard. He had no trailer, no feed, barely enough gas to get back. And now, standing on land everyone else called worthless, he was responsible for a living thing that might not survive the day. Ranch life teaches you one unforgiving rule. If you take responsibility, you don't get to back out when it gets hard. Scott pulled off his hat and wiped his face. The sun was brutal. His throat already burned with thirst. He took a small step closer. "Hey," he said softly. "Easy." The horse lifted its head again. Its eyes were dark, dull, but alert. Still thinking. Still there. That's when Scott noticed the rope burns. Old ones. Healed poorly. Lines around the neck and muzzle where something had once pulled too hard for too long. This horse hadn't just been abandoned. It had been worked past the point of care. Anger flared hot and fast. Scott checked the ground again and finally spotted it. Something half buried near a rock outcropping. A rusted metal barrel on its side. He jogged over, heart hammering. Empty. Of course it was empty. He stood there, breathing hard, calculating. Ranchers calculate constantly. Distance, time, risk, survival. The nearest town was over 90 miles away. Walking back alone would be brutal. Walking back with a horse in this condition? Impossible. Unless... Scott turned slowly, scanning the land with new eyes. High desert doesn't look generous, but it hides things. Old ranchers say the land tests you before it feeds you. The trick is knowing where to look. He spotted a darker line of soil near the ravine wall. Subtle, almost invisible unless you knew what dryness looked like. Scott knelt, pressed his palm to the ground. Cool. His pulse spiked. He grabbed a flat rock and scraped at the earth. Dust gave way to packed clay. Another scrape, then darker soil, then moisture. Not much, but enough. Scott laughed once, sharp and disbelieving. He dug with his hands until his fingers ached, carving a shallow depression. Water seeped in slowly, reluctant, but real. He cupped it, brought it to his mouth, tasted it. Brackish, mineral heavy, but drinkable. Scott looked back at the horse. "All right," he said quietly. "You're not done yet." He widened the hole, let more water pool. Then he stepped back and waited. Didn't rush, didn't force. Ranch animals decide when they trust you. The horse took one step, then another. Each movement looked like it cost something. When it reached the water, it lowered its head and drank desperately, then slowed, instinct kicking in, conserving energy. Scott watched, heart pounding, afraid to hope. Minutes passed. The sun crawled lower. The desert stayed silent, like it was holding its breath. When the horse finally lifted its head, something had changed. Not strength, not yet, but awareness. It looked at Scott again. Really looked this time. And in that moment, Scott felt it. The weight of what this land was asking from him. This wasn't luck. This wasn't coincidence. This was a test. The kind that doesn't care about your plans or your bank account. If he walked away now, the horse would die. Slowly. Alone. Forgotten like the land itself. Scott sat down hard on a rock, hands shaking. "I don't even know how to save you," he whispered. The horse shifted closer, unsteady but intentional, as if it had made a decision of its own. And that was when Scott noticed something else. Hoof prints. Old ones. Faint. Leading away from the ravine in a direction Scott hadn't explored yet. Not random. Repeated. Someone, or something, had been coming back here, and suddenly the land didn't feel empty at all. Scott followed the hoof prints slowly, not because he was cautious, but because the land demanded patience. Each step told a story. Worn edges, drag marks, slight veers where exhaustion had forced the horse to choose uneven ground over straight lines. This wasn't wandering. This was routine. The horse had been walking this path again and again, clinging to something it remembered. Memory keeps animals alive longer than strength does. The prints led toward a low ridge that looked like nothing more than a wrinkle in the desert. Scott almost missed it. Most people would have. But ranchers learn to read land the way doctors read symptoms. Small changes matter. As he crested the ridge, the air changed. Not cooler, different. The smell hit first. Damp earth. Faint, but unmistakable. Scott stopped dead. His heart kicked hard in his chest. Water doesn't announce itself out here. It hides. It survives by staying forgotten. He moved faster now, boots crunching over stone. On the other side of the ridge, the ground dipped sharply into a narrow basin, protected from the worst of the sun by stone walls that leaned inward like they were guarding something. And there it was, a shallow spring. Not a creek, not a stream, just a slow, stubborn seep pushing its way up through cracked rock. The water pooled into a natural basin no wider than a pickup hood, ringed with dark soil and stubborn green growth that looked impossible against the surrounding desert. Scott let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. This was why the land hadn't been claimed. No road access, no paperwork, no recorded water rights. But water didn't care about paperwork. He knelt and touched it again. Cool, clean, moving. The horse came up behind him, slow but steady now, and drank like it knew this place, like it had been here before. Scott watched closely, noticing how the animal angled its body, favoring one leg. Old injury. Healed wrong. Another reason someone might have dumped it. Anger simmered again, but this time it was focused. "All right," Scott said softly. "You've been keeping a secret." He sat there for a long while, letting the implications settle. Water changes everything in ranching. Water is survival. Water is value. Water is the difference between worthless land and land people will fight over. And suddenly, the sympathetic look from the county clerk made sense. 30 years abandoned. 30 years ignored. 30 years of everyone assuming nothing could live here. Scott stood and turned slowly, scanning the basin. There were signs now that he knew how to see them. Old fence posts, half rotted, swallowed by brush. A collapsed line shack tucked against the rock wall, its roof caved in long ago. Someone had tried once, failed, or been forced out. The desert doesn't let go of history. It buries it until the right person shows up. Scott felt a chill crawl up his arms, despite the heat. If this spring was still flowing after decades of neglect, it wasn't fragile. It was persistent, just like the horse. He glanced back at the animal, which stood quietly now, ears forward, watching him like it was waiting for instructions. "You saved yourself," Scott said. "I just followed." The realization hit him slowly and all at once. This horse hadn't wandered onto his land by accident. It had survived here. It had learned this place. And now it had led him to the one thing that made the land viable. The desert hadn't changed Scott's life. The horse had. Scott spent the rest of the day clearing brush around the spring, reinforcing the basin with stones, working until his hands blistered and his back screamed. Ranch work always comes with pain, but this time it felt earned. As the sun dipped low, painting the rocks red and gold, Scott sat beside the spring and did something he hadn't done in years. He planned. Shelter first, feed next, then fencing. Slow, careful, legal. Because now that he knew what was here, the danger wasn't survival. It was discovery. If the wrong person found this water, if the county took a second look, if someone realized what $25 had actually bought. Scott looked out over the desert, suddenly aware that the quiet wasn't empty anymore. It was watching again. Scott slept that night against the rock wall, using his jacket as a pillow and the stars as a ceiling. The desert doesn't lull you to sleep. It dares you to close your eyes. Every sound felt amplified. The scrape of stone cooling, the distant yip of something hunting, the slow, steady breathing of the horse a few yards away, lying down for the first time since he'd found it. That mattered. Horses don't lie down unless they feel safe, or too exhausted to stand. Scott didn't know which one this was, and that uncertainty gnawed at him. Before dawn, he woke to movement. Not close, far. A low rumble carried through the basin, faint but unmistakable. An engine. Scott froze, heart pounding. No roads led here. That was the whole point. Whoever that was, they weren't passing through by accident. He crawled to the edge of the rock wall and peered out. A dust plume rose miles away, thin and deliberate, like someone moving slow on purpose. Scott counted the seconds between sound and sight. Old ranch habit. The vehicle. This land was supposed to be forgotten. He checked the horse. It was on its feet now, ears pinned forward, body tense. Animals know when trouble is shaped like a machine. Scott weighed his options fast. No cell signal, no backup, no legal protection yet beyond a folded deed in his pocket that wouldn't mean much if things went sideways. If someone else knew about the spring, the land, the horse. The engine cut. Silence rushed back in, heavier than before. Scott waited. 30 seconds. A minute. 2. Then he heard boots on rock. A man appeared at the ridgeline silhouetted against the rising sun. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dust-stained hat and moving like someone who'd walked this land many times before. The stranger stopped when he saw Scott. They stared at each other across the basin, neither speaking. The desert held its breath. "You're a long way from anywhere," the man finally said. "So are you," Scott replied. The man's eyes drifted past Scott, locking onto the horse. Something flickered across his face. Recognition. Maybe guilt. Maybe calculation. "That animal yours?" the man asked. Scott didn't answer right away. Ranchers learn that silence is sometimes the strongest fence you can build. "It is now," Scott said. The man exhaled through his nose, a humorless sound. "Figures." He took a few steps down the slope, hands visible but relaxed. Not threatening. Not friendly either. "You buy this land at auction?" the man asked. Scott felt the words like a punch, so someone was watching. "County sale," Scott said carefully. The man nodded slowly. "Thought so. Name's Keller. Been grazing near here for years." "Near here?" Scott said. "This is 90 miles from the nearest ranch." Keller smiled thinly. "You'd be surprised what near means out here." Scott's grip tightened on the rock beside him. This wasn't a casual encounter. Keller knew about the spring, about the horse, about the value buried under decades of neglect. "That horse wandered off my line last winter," Keller continued. "Didn't think it'd last." Scott felt heat surge up his spine. "You left it." Keller shrugged. "Desert makes decisions for you." "No," Scott said quietly. "People do." The silence stretched again, sharp now. Keller glanced toward the spring, then back at Scott. "This land's trouble," he said. "Always has been. Folks come out here thinking they found something. Usually ends bad." "For who?" Scott asked. Keller's eyes hardened. "Depends who's got the paperwork, and who's got the patience." The unspoken message landed heavy. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. Keller tipped his hat once, then turned and walked back toward the ridge. "Think about what you're getting into," he called over his shoulder. "Some things stay abandoned for a reason." Scott watched him disappear, chest tight, mind racing. The desert went quiet again. But this time, it didn't feel neutral. It felt territorial. Scott didn't move for a long time after Keller disappeared over the ridge. Out here, stillness isn't passive. It's defensive. He replayed every word, every pause. Keller hadn't threatened him. Not directly, but ranchers don't need threats spelled out. Territory is language enough. And Keller's visit wasn't curiosity. It was confirmation. Someone else knew. Scott turned toward the spring again, suddenly aware that what had felt like a gift now felt like liability. Water draws life. It also draws attention. If Keller had been grazing near here for years, that meant others might have tried too, and failed. Scott walked the perimeter slowly, studying the basin with new urgency. He noticed fresh tire marks now, faint but undeniable, leading toward the ridge. Keller hadn't stumbled in. He had a route, a way back. That changed the math. By midday, Scott had made a decision. Ranchers don't wait for problems to mature. They meet them early, before they grow teeth. He packed what little he had and led the horse toward the ridge, not away from danger, but toward information. The horse followed without hesitation, limping but willing. Trust like that isn't given lightly. The climb was brutal. Heat pressed down. The land offered no shade, no mercy. But from the ridge top, Scott saw it. The faint cut of an old two-track road snaking through the desert like a scar someone tried to forget. That was Keller's access. Scott memorized it. Distance, direction, where it vanished into the land. He turned back before anyone could see him. That night he built a fire small enough not to travel far. As he worked, Scott talked to the horse. Not nonsense, but steady, grounding words. Ranchers know animals don't care what you say. They care how you say it. "You didn't deserve what happened to you," Scott said quietly. "But you're not done." The horse shifted closer to the warmth, breathing easier now. Scott noticed its eyes again. Still alert. Still present. Whatever pain it carried, it hadn't surrendered to it. Neither had Scott. By the third day, he'd made a crude shelter from scrap wood and canvas he found near the collapsed shack. It wasn't pretty, but it blocked wind and cast shade. He rationed water carefully, expanding the spring basin inch by inch, never pushing it too far. You don't rush a source that's survived decades on its own terms. Late that afternoon, a truck appeared again on the ridge. Different shape, different sound. Scott froze, heart pounding. This one didn't stop at the ridge. It rolled down toward the basin slowly, deliberately, like whoever was driving wanted to be seen. Dust rose behind it, thick and unapologetic. The truck stopped 50 yards away. A man stepped out, younger than Keller, leaner, eyes sharp. He scanned the area, taking in the shelter, the spring, the horse. "Well, I'll be damned," the man said. "Looks like someone beat us to it." "Us." Scott's jaw tightened. "Who are you?" Scott asked. The man smiled like it was a courtesy, not a courtesy he intended to return. "Name's Rourke. I work for Keller." Of course he did. Rourke kicked a rock, hands resting casually near his belt. "Boss figured if someone bought this land, they'd show up eventually. Guess you're it." Scott said nothing. Rourke glanced at the horse. "That thing's still breathing. Tougher than it looks." Scott felt his fists clench. "What do you want?" Rourke's smile faded just enough to matter. "Straight talk. You don't have the infrastructure. You don't have backing. And once the county realizes there's water here, paperwork's going to get complicated." Scott met his eyes. "I have a deed." Rourke shrugged. Deeds don't mean much when mistakes get corrected. The message was clear now. Pressure was coming. Not violence, bureaucracy, influence, attrition. Rourke stepped back toward the truck. "Think about selling," he said. "Walk away with something instead of nothing." The engine started. Dust swallowed him as the truck pulled away. Scott stood there long after it vanished, pulse roaring in his ears. He looked at the horse, at the spring, at the shelter he'd built with blistered hands. $25 had bought land, but staying was going to cost everything else, and Scott knew, deep in his bones, that the desert wasn't done testing him yet. Scott didn't sleep that night, not because of fear, but because clarity had finally arrived. Rourke's words replayed over and over. Mistakes get corrected. That wasn't bluffing. That was how land changed hands quietly in places where distance protected bad behavior. Scott had seen it before on other ranches. Paperwork delayed, boundaries questioned, pressure applied until the weaker man folded. And Scott was supposed to be the weaker man. He stood before dawn and walked the perimeter again, this time not as a trespasser or a dreamer, but as an owner. Every step was deliberate. He marked natural lines, rock clusters, old fence remnants. He etched a rough map in his notebook, the same one he'd once used to plan a life that never happened. This was the plan now. The horse followed him the entire time. That mattered more than Scott expected. Animals don't follow uncertainty. They follow intent. The horse stayed close, favoring its injured leg but refusing to fall behind. Scott stopped twice to let it rest, using the time to study its movement. The limp was real, but it wasn't worsening. With water and shade, the animal was stabilizing. Hope, Scott knew, was dangerous, but so was ignoring progress. By midday, Scott reached the old line shack again. He pulled away debris and uncovered something he'd missed before, a rusted metal box wedged beneath a collapsed beam. He pried it open. Inside were papers, old ones, handwritten notes, grazing logs, a sketched map showing the spring, clearly marked with dates stretching back nearly 40 years. Names Scott didn't recognize. One in particular was circled repeatedly. E. Calder. Scott's breath slowed. This wasn't undocumented land. It was erased land. Someone had tried to establish this place once, legitimately, and something had stopped them. That night, Scott made a call. He drove until he found a single bar of service standing on the hood of his truck like it might disappear beneath him. He called the county office, asked questions carefully, casually, the way ranchers do when they don't want alarms triggered. The clerk's tone shifted when Scott mentioned Lot 32. "That property," the man said. "You're actually out there." "I am." A pause. Papers rustled. "Son," the clerk said slowly, "you might want to come in." Scott hung up without responding. The desert had gone quiet again. But now Scott understood why. The land wasn't testing him to see if he could survive. It was testing whether he could hold. And as he walked back toward the spring, the horse lifted its head and stepped forward to meet him, stronger than it had been days before. Something had changed, and whatever Keller thought was abandoned. Wasn't leaving quietly. Scott reached the county office just after it opened. The building looked harmless. Beige walls, fluorescent lights, a place where decisions were supposed to be neutral. But ranchers know better. Real battles over land rarely involve shouting. They happen in rooms like this with coffee rings on desks and voices kept low. The clerk from the auction recognized him immediately. "You actually went out there," the clerk said, half disbelief, half warning. "I did," Scott replied, "and I found water." The word water landed like a dropped tool. The clerk leaned back, eyes narrowing, not in anger, but calculation. That complicates things. "For who?" Scott asked. The clerk didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled a thin folder from a drawer. Lot 32. Scott's land. The folder was thinner than it should have been. "That property," the clerk said carefully, "has history." Scott nodded. E. Calder. The clerk's eyebrows rose. "You did some digging." "Enough." The clerk sighed and rubbed his face. Calder tried to formalize water rights in the late 80s, filed preliminary claims, never completed the process. "Why not?" Another pause, this one heavier. "Pressure," the clerk said. "Adjacent grazing interests, disputes, complaints. Calder ran out of money before it got resolved." Scott thought of Keller, of Rourke, of the old two-track road no one was supposed to know about. "So the county let it die," Scott said. "We let it sit," the clerk corrected. "There's a difference." Scott leaned forward. "I have a deed, I have water, and I'm not walking away." The clerk studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Then you need to file intent, improvements, usage, and you need witnesses." "Witnesses?" "People who can say you're actually working the land, living there, not speculating." Scott almost laughed. "I'm sleeping against rocks." "That'll help," the clerk said dryly. By the time Scott left, he had forms tucked under his arm and a new understanding of the fight ahead. This wasn't about muscle. It was about endurance, about staying visible long enough that the system had to acknowledge you. When Scott returned to the property, the horse greeted him at the edge of the basin. That mattered more than the paperwork. Over the next weeks, Scott worked like a man racing a clock no one else could see. He repaired fencing just enough to mark intent, built a sturdier shelter, hauled scrap lumber from miles away. Every improvement was small, but documented, photographed, logged. Keller came twice, didn't speak, just watched. Once, Scott caught Rourke taking pictures from the ridge. Scott waved, calm, deliberate. Ranchers know confidence unsettles men who expect retreat. The horse grew stronger. Its coat regained shine. Its eyes sharpened. One morning, Scott noticed it trotting. Awkward, uneven, but proud. Scott smiled despite himself. "You're not just surviving," he said. "You're staying." Then, one afternoon, a county truck appeared on the horizon. Not Keller's, not Rourke's. Official. Scott stood by the spring as two men stepped out, clipboards in hand. They examined the water, the shelter, the fencing, the horse. One of them looked at Scott and said, "Didn't expect to find this." Scott met his gaze evenly. "Neither did anyone else." The man nodded slowly. "Looks like this land's been misunderstood." Scott felt his pulse steady. Misunderstood land doesn't stay cheap forever. And as the officials walked the basin, Keller stood watching from the ridge, far enough to deny involvement, close enough to know he was losing control. The desert stayed quiet, but for the first time, it felt like it was on Scott's side. The letter arrived 2 weeks later, not by email, not by phone call. Paper, Scott recognized the envelope the moment he saw the county seal. His hands were dirty from repairing fence wire, but he didn't care. He tore it open, standing in the wind, the horse watching from a few yards away like it understood this mattered. Preliminary water use acknowledgement. Scott read the words 3 times. Not approval, not ownership, but acknowledgement. The county was officially aware that water existed on Lot 32, and that Scott was using it, which meant 2 things at once. He was protected, and he was exposed. Within days, things changed. The 2-track road saw more traffic. Trucks slowed near the ridge. Once a drone buzzed overhead, high and quick, pretending to be a bird until Scott stared straight at it. Keller didn't come down anymore. He sent others. One morning, Scott found stakes driven near the property line. Fresh, bright, meant to provoke. Scott pulled them out and stacked them neatly at the edge of the road where anyone passing would see them. A message without words. The horse reacted to the tension. It stayed closer now, ears flicking constantly. Scott took time each day to work with it. Slow walks, gentle pressure, rebuilding trust. He didn't name it yet. Ranchers don't name animals they might lose. But this one felt different. Late one afternoon, Rourke returned. This time without a truck. He walked in from the ridge, hands visible, posture less confident than before. Scott didn't stop what he was doing. He kept repairing a fence post, deliberate, unhurried. "Boss is nervous," Rourke said. Scott didn't look up. Then he should stop watching. Rourke shifted. "County's sniffing around. That's bad for everyone." "Only for people hiding things," Scott replied. Rourke exhaled. "You could still sell. Quiet. Clean." Scott finally turned. "I'm not leaving." Silence stretched. Rourke glanced at the horse. "That animal's the reason, isn't it?" Scott didn't answer. Rourke nodded anyway. "Figures." He turned and walked away without another word. That night, Scott sat beside the spring and listened to the desert settle. Stars burned bright overhead. The horse lay nearby, legs tucked beneath it, breathing slow and deep. Scott realized then what this place had given him. Not money, not security. Purpose. The land wasn't a prize. It was a responsibility. And in choosing to stay, Scott had drawn a line that couldn't be erased quietly anymore. Somewhere beyond the ridge, Keller was running out of options. And men who lose quiet control don't always leave quietly. The confrontation didn't come loud. It came ordinary. That's what unsettled Scott most. No engines roaring in, no raised voices, no threats carried on the wind. Just a county truck parked near the ridge one morning, long enough to be noticed, short enough to look routine. By the time Scott reached it, 2 men were already stepping out, same officials as before, but their posture was different, less curious, more cautious. "Morning," one of them said. "We need to walk the boundaries again." Scott nodded and didn't ask why. He already knew. As they moved along the perimeter, one of the men stopped near the spring and frowned. "You been noticing any interference?" Scott paused, measured the moment. Ranchers know when honesty is strength and when it's a liability. "Yes," Scott said. "Markers pulled, photos taken, pressure." The men exchanged a look. "That's what we thought," the second one said. "You're not the first person to try claiming water out here." "But I'm still here," Scott replied. That earned him a long look. Before they could continue, another vehicle appeared. Keller's truck. It rolled up slowly, stopping just outside the basin. Keller stepped out, face calm, hands open like this was all perfectly reasonable. "Didn't expect company," Keller said pleasantly. The county official stiffened. "Mr. Keller, you're not listed as an adjacent landholder." Keller smiled thinly. "Grazing permits overlap in funny ways." Scott watched the exchange carefully. This wasn't a standoff of strength, it was leverage, and Keller was trying to remind everyone he still had some. "You're contesting this?" the official asked. Keller looked at Scott, then at the spring. "I'm asking questions about usage, longevity, impact." Scott felt heat rise but kept his voice level. "You abandoned this place." Keller's eyes hardened. "I didn't claim it." "You benefited from it," Scott said, "without paying." The silence that followed was sharp. The county official cleared his throat. "We'll need statements, records, and testimony." Keller's jaw tightened. This was what he'd wanted to avoid. Paper trails. Scott felt something shift, not victory, but balance. The system wasn't on his side, but it wasn't ignoring him anymore either. As the officials packed up, Keller stepped closer to Scott. "You're stubborn," Keller said quietly. Scott met his gaze. "So is the land." Keller studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. "Then we'll see who lasts longer." That night, Scott sat beside the horse again, running a hand along its neck. The animal leaned into the touch, solid now, present, alive. Scott finally gave it a name. "Calder," he said softly. The horse flicked an ear, not for the man who lost the land, but for the one who never let it go. And as Scott looked out across the basin, he understood something final. This fight wasn't about ownership anymore. It was about proving that abandonment doesn't erase responsibility. And Scott wasn't leaving. The decision came 6 months later, not with drama, not with applause, just a letter. Scott stood in the doorway of the shelter as he read it, wind tugging at the paper like the desert wanted to say. Calder grazed nearby, head low, strong now, scarred but steady. The land looked different too, not greener, not tamed, but awake. The county ruling was simple. Water use recognized. Improvements validated. No competing claims upheld. Keller's name appeared once in the document. Only once. As a non-party. A man who had hovered too long without stepping forward when it mattered. Scott folded the letter carefully and tucked it into his notebook. No celebration followed. Ranchers don't celebrate paperwork. They acknowledge it and get back to work. Over time, the pressure faded. The trucks stopped coming. The ridge went quiet for good. Keller never returned. Men who lose patience fights tend to retreat without announcing it. Scott built slowly. Always slowly. A better shelter. A proper corral. Rain catchment tied carefully into the spring so it was never overdrawn. He learned the land's limits and stayed inside them. The desert rewards restraint more than ambition. Calder became more than a symbol. He became proof. Visitors who did make it out, surveyors, inspectors, the occasional curious neighbor, always asked the same question. Why stay out here? Scott never answered the same way twice. Sometimes he said, because someone had to. Sometimes he just gestured at the horse. Years later, Scott sold a small grazing lease, just enough to stabilize his income. Not to Keller, never to Keller. He kept the heart of the land untouched. The spring remained quiet, protected, unnamed on most maps. $25 had bought him dirt. But showing up every day, when no one was watching, when walking away would have been easier, that's what bought him a future. The desert didn't give Scott a miracle. It gave him a choice. And when a starving horse appeared on land everyone else had given up on, Scott chose not to abandon what had already been abandoned once. Out here, that's how ownership really begins.